The office sits 3 meters underground, beneath the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production in Berlin. It is the morning of March 8, 1943. The concrete walls are thick enough to muffle the sound of the city above the rumble of trucks, the distant wail of air raid sirens testing their circuits, the everyday noise of a capital at war. But they cannot muffle what is happening on the desk of Dr. Rolf Wagenfuhr. He is 42 years old, an economist, not a soldier, wire-rimmed glasses, thinning hair, the kind of man who speaks in percentages and aggregates, who finds comfort in columns of numbers where others see only tedium. For the past year, he has headed the statistical section of the planning department in Albert Speer's ministry. His job is deceptively simple. Count everything. German tank production, Allied tank production, steel tonnage, aircraft engines, artillery shells, rubber imports, fuel consumption, the mathematics of total war, reduced to rows and columns on onion skin paper. The report before him is 53 pages long, typed on both sides to conserve paper itself, now a rationed commodity. The title reads, Comparative Analysis of Industrial War Production, Germany and Allied Powers, 1942 to 1943. He has checked the calculations 3 times. The numbers refuse to change. Germany is not merely losing the war of production. Germany is being buried by it, outproduced by margins so vast they seem like clerical errors. But they are not errors. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The conclusion sits on page 49, underlined twice in pencil. Current production disparities render strategic victory mathematically improbable, absent radical alteration of enemy industrial capacity. It is the language of bureaucracy, the careful phrasing of a man who knows his report will be read by people who do not want to hear what it says. Translated into plain speech, it means, we have already lost. The only question is how long arithmetic takes to assert itself on the battlefield. Wagenfuhr leans back in his chair. The numbers are irrefutable. The Americans alone, just the Americans, not counting the British or the Soviets, are outproducing the entire German Reich in nearly every category of war material. Not by narrow margins, not by amounts that could be overcome with better efficiency or longer working hours or more clever engineering. By ratios of 3 to 1, 5 to 1, in some categories 10 to 1. On paper, Nazi Germany has already been defeated. What remains is simply the physical process of that defeat manifesting in burned cities and broken armies and millions of dead. But here, in this underground office in March of 1943, a German economist can see the future written in production statistics. He can calculate, with reasonable precision, when the Wehrmacht will run out of tanks, when the Luftwaffe will run out of fuel, when the entire apparatus of the Third Reich will collapse under the weight of its own material poverty. This is not a story about battles. It is a story about the men who saw the numbers and understood what they meant and found themselves powerless to change anything. To understand how these numbers came to sit on a desk in Berlin, how German economists found themselves calculating the precise mathematics of their own extinction, we must go back to before the war, when Germany still believed in blitzkrieg, when quick victories made logistics seem like an inconvenient detail, when the entire German way of war was predicated on the assumption that industrial capacity would never matter because wars would be over before factories could reach full production. This assumption was not entirely unreasonable. It was based on recent experience. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 27 days later, Poland ceased to exist as an independent state. In April of 1940, German forces overran Denmark in 6 hours and Norway in 2 months. In May, they invaded France and the Low Countries. 6 weeks later, France surrendered. These were not prolonged wars of attrition. These were surgical strikes, mechanized warfare at its most effective armored divisions, punching through defensive lines, air power destroying communication networks, speed and violence overwhelming defenders before they could organize coherent resistance. The Wehrmacht called this blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The operational concept was elegant. Use concentrated armor and air power to create rapid breakthroughs, then exploit those breakthroughs before the enemy could react. Keep moving. Never let the enemy establish defensive positions. Win the campaign before it becomes a war. This approach had profound implications for industrial planning. If wars lasted weeks or months instead of years, then stockpiling war material became less important than maintaining operational readiness. Why convert every civilian factory to military production if you would need those civilian factories again in 6 months? Why build massive reserve stocks of ammunition if campaigns ended before existing stocks were depleted? German war production in 1940 reflected this philosophy. Aircraft production that year was 10,800 planes, substantial, but not the total mobilization of German industrial capacity. Tank production was just under 3,000 vehicles. The German economy remained substantially civilian. Restaurants stayed open. Consumer goods continued to be manufactured. Young men were conscripted into the Wehrmacht, but factory workers producing civilian products were often exempt from military service. This was the blitzkrieg economy, lean, efficient, built for short, victorious wars. It worked brilliantly until it did not. The breaking point came in June of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be another lightning campaign. German intelligence estimated the Red Army would collapse within 8 to 12 weeks. The plan was to destroy Soviet forces in the western regions through encirclement battles, seize Moscow and Leningrad, and force Soviet capitulation before winter. It almost worked. In the first months, German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies, and captured millions of prisoners. By late autumn, advance units could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. Victory seemed imminent, but the Soviet Union did not collapse. The Red Army suffered catastrophic losses and kept fighting. Soviet industry, already in the process of evacuating eastward beyond the range of German bombers, continued producing tanks and artillery. When winter came earlier and more severe than German planners had anticipated, the Wehrmacht found itself fighting a grinding war of attrition in conditions for which it was not prepared. And this was when the mathematics of industrial war began to matter. The Soviet Union was vast. Its population in 1941 was nearly 200 million people, almost 3 times Germany's population. It possessed enormous natural resources: oil, coal, iron ore, copper, timber. When German forces overran the western industrial regions, Soviet authorities simply moved the factories. Entire production facilities were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and relocated to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia regions far beyond German reach. Historians would later document the scale of this evacuation with precision. 2,500 factories relocated. 17 million people moved east with the factories. Production of 34 tanks, which had been concentrated in the Kharkov tractor factory and other western plants, was re-established in the Posis facilities near the Ural Mountains by early 1942. The Soviet Union lost enormous amounts of industrial capacity to German occupation, yet by the middle of 1942, Soviet military production was exceeding pre-war levels. This should have been impossible, but it was happening. Meanwhile, the Germans were learning that their own industrial capacity had limits. Maintaining armies on the Eastern Front required enormous amounts of material, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food, winter equipment. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, constantly threatened by partisan attacks. Locomotives and trucks wore out. Rail lines needed constant repair. The Wehrmacht was discovering what Napoleon had learned a century earlier. Russia consumes armies. And then, in December of 1941, another variable entered the equation. The United States declared war on Germany. Before the war, the German intelligence service, known as the WWII, had collected substantial information about American industrial capacity. They knew the basic statistics. The United States produced more steel than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Its automotive industry built millions of vehicles every year, more cars in a single year than Germany had built in a decade. It had vast natural resources: oil from Texas and California, iron ore from Minnesota, copper from Montana, rubber from territories in the Pacific. But most German strategic planners did not consider America a serious threat. This was not because they lacked intelligence about American capabilities. It was because they fundamentally misunderstood what those capabilities meant. The United States was 3,000 miles away, across an ocean. It had a small peacetime army, barely 200,000 men in 1940, smaller than Poland's army. Americans were perceived as soft, unmilitary, divided by ethnic tensions and political disagreements. They had not fought a major land war since 1865. How could such a nation pose a credible threat to the Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe? More fundamentally, German planners did not understand how American industrial organization worked. They saw the automotive industry and thought, automobiles. They did not understand that the same factories, the same supply chains, the same managerial expertise that built 20 million cars could be converted to building tanks and trucks and aircraft engines. They did not grasp that American industry was not just large but flexible, not just productive but adaptable. When President Roosevelt announced in May of 1940 that America would produce 50,000 aircraft per year, German intelligence analysts dismissed it as propaganda. 50,000. The entire Luftwaffe had fewer than 5,000 combat aircraft. The British Royal Air Force had perhaps 3,000. Roosevelt's number seemed not just optimistic but delusional, the kind of absurd boast made by politicians who did not understand industrial realities. But by 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft per year, not 50,000, nearly 100,000. Along with 17,000 tanks, 2,000 warships, hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps, millions of rifles and artillery pieces, vast quantities of ammunition and fuel and food, and every other commodity needed to sustain mechanized warfare across multiple continents. The Blitzkrieg economy had worked because Germany's enemies had been unprepared, poorly led, or simply unlucky. But now Germany faced enemies who were prepared, who possessed greater industrial resources, and who understood that modern warfare was as much about production capacity as battlefield tactics. The war was becoming what the Germans themselves called Materialschlacht, a battle of material, and Germany was comprehensively outmatched. By early 1943, when Dr. Wagenfuhr sat down to compile his report, this reality was becoming undeniable. The question was whether anyone in the German leadership would accept what the numbers were saying. Rolf Wagenfuhr was born in Leipzig in 1901, the son of a textile merchant who had built a modest but successful business, importing cotton and selling finished cloth to manufacturers throughout Saxony. His childhood was comfortable, middle class, shaped by the rhythms of commerce rather than militarism. He was bookish, methodical, good with numbers. His father wanted him to study business and eventually take over the textile firm. Rolf wanted to understand how economies worked. He enrolled at the University of Leipzig to study economics. The 1920s in Germany were years of chaos, hyperinflation, political extremism, economic collapse followed by precarious recovery. For a young economist, it was fascinating and terrifying. Wagenfuhr threw himself into his studies, particularly statistical analysis and industrial economics. Numbers, he discovered, had a clarity that political rhetoric lacked. You could argue about ideology, but production statistics were simply facts. In 1928, he received a fellowship to study at Columbia University in New York. He spent 2 years in America, and those years shaped his understanding of industrial economics more than any textbook. He visited factories in Detroit, steel mills in Pennsylvania, stockyards in Chicago. What struck him was not just the scale, though the scale was extraordinary, but the organization. American industry was rational, systematic, built on principles of mass production and efficiency that German industry had barely begun to adopt. He attended lectures by American economists, read papers on industrial organization, studied supply chain management. He learned about Frederick Taylor's scientific management principles, about Henry Ford's assembly line innovations, about the ways American corporations organized production to maximize output. When he returned to Germany in 1930, he brought with him a deep appreciation for what industrial capacity really meant, not just factories, but the entire ecosystem of suppliers, transportation networks, financial systems, and management practices that allowed those factories to function efficiently. The timing was unfortunate. By 1930, Germany was sliding into the Depression. Unemployment soared. Political extremism flourished. The Weimar Republic, never stable, began its final disintegration. Wagenfuhr found work as a researcher at economic institutes in Berlin, publishing academic papers on trade policy and industrial statistics. He was not political, or rather, his politics were the politics of numbers. Economics was a science, he believed. It could be studied objectively, without reference to ideology. But in Germany in the 1930s, nothing was without ideology. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began reshaping every aspect of German society to fit their racial and militaristic worldview. By 1937, it was becoming difficult to work in any professional capacity without joining the Nazi Party. Wagenfuhr joined. Not enthusiastically, not because he believed in National Socialist ideology, but because he wanted to continue working, and party membership was increasingly a prerequisite for professional employment. He was not alone in this calculation. Hundreds of thousands of Germans made similar compromises joining the party, attending rallies, repeating slogans they did not believe because the alternative was professional and social exclusion. Later, after the war, many would claim they had been secret opponents of the regime, forcing participants who had done only what was necessary to survive. Wagenfuhr never made such claims. He had joined because it was expedient. He had worked for the Nazi regime because that was where the work was. If these facts made him complicit, so be it. The numbers did not change based on one's political virtue. In 1938, he was hired by the Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung, the Institute for Economic Research, which was becoming increasingly involved in military economic planning. When war came in September of 1939, Wagenfuhr found himself doing what he had always done, collecting data, producing reports, analyzing economic statistics. Except now the statistics were about military production, and the reports went to ministries preparing for total war. He was good at this work, precise, thorough. The kind of man who could look at raw production data from dozens of factories and identify patterns, predict bottlenecks, and calculate future output based on current trends. His reports were valued not because they told people what they wanted to hear, but because they were reliable. When Albert Speer became Minister of Armaments and War Production in February of 1942, he began consolidating control over German war production. Speer was an architect by training, not an economist, but he understood the importance of accurate information. He wanted to know what Germany was actually producing, not what propaganda claimed it was producing. He wanted statistics that were honest, even if honesty was uncomfortable. In early 1943, Wagenfuhr was brought into the planning department of Speer's ministry and given a small staff, 6 people, all economists and statisticians. His mandate was straightforward: analyze German production capacity, estimate enemy production capacity, and provide regular reports comparing the two. Tell us, Speer's office said, what the enemy can produce. Tell us whether we can match them. It was the kind of assignment Wagenfuhr had been training for his entire professional life. He approached it with characteristic methodicism, establishing procedures for data collection, creating standardized reporting formats, building relationships with other departments that had pieces of the information he needed. Within weeks, he had production reports flowing to his office from factories across Germany and occupied Europe. But getting accurate data about enemy production was harder. The Allies did not publish their production statistics. German intelligence services collected fragments, reconnaissance photographs of factory complexes, reports from agents in neutral countries, intercepted communications, captured documents. Wagenführer's job was to assemble these fragments into coherent estimates. He was aided by one unusual source. The Allies themselves were sometimes remarkably indiscreet. British newspapers published articles celebrating production milestones. American politicians gave speeches boasting about war production. Soviet propaganda proclaimed the output of factories that had been evacuated east. Much of this was exaggeration or deliberate deception, but not all of it. Cross-referenced against other intelligence sources, analyzed carefully, the public statements often proved surprisingly accurate. And then there were the captured documents. When German forces overran Soviet territory in 1941 and 42, they seized factory records, production plans, supply manifests. Similar material came from other sources: papers recovered from crashed aircraft, documents found on captured officers, intelligence provided by defectors or collaborators. By late 1942, Wagenführer's section had accumulated enough data to begin producing comparative analyses. The first reports were tentative, hedged with caveats about uncertainty. But as more data arrived, as patterns became clearer, as estimates were checked against physical evidence, the number of tanks appearing on battlefields, the types of aircraft shot down, the volume of supplies captured, the picture came into focus. And that picture was catastrophic. The methodology Wagenführer used was straightforward. For major categories of war material aircraft, tanks, artillery, warships, merchant shipping, trucks, ammunition, steel, aluminum, synthetic fuel, he compiled production figures month by month. German production was relatively easy to track. His office received reports from the factories. Allied production required estimation, but by cross-referencing multiple sources, he could generate figures he was confident were accurate within 10 or 15%. The comparisons were stark. Aircraft production for 1942. Germany produced 15,600 aircraft that year. This included fighters, bombers, ground attack planes, transports, everything with an engine and wings. It was more than Germany had produced in 1941. Production was increasing, which was good, but it was not increasing fast enough. The United States produced 47,800 aircraft in 1942. This was their first full year of war production. American factories were still ramping up, still converting from civilian to military production, still learning how to build warplanes efficiently, and already they were outproducing Germany by a ratio of 3-1. The Soviet Union, despite having lost enormous industrial capacity to German occupation, produced 25,400 aircraft in 1942. This was astonishing. Soviet factories that had been evacuated east in 1941 were already producing more aircraft than all of Germany. Britain produced 23,600 aircraft. Britain, exhausted by 3 years of war, bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe, cut off from European resources. Britain alone was outproducing Germany. Total Allied aircraft production in 1942, 96,800 planes. Total German production, 15,600. Ratio, 6.2-1. Tank production for 1942. Germany produced 6,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. This included everything from light reconnaissance vehicles to heavy Tigers. Again, production was increasing compared to previous years. Speer's rationalization efforts were working. German factories were becoming more efficient. The United States produced 24,000 tanks in 1942. Most were M4 Sherman's medium tanks, reliable if unspectacular, designed for mass production. American factories were treating tanks the way they had once treated automobiles: standardized designs, interchangeable parts, assembly line production. The Soviet Union produced 24,700 tanks. Most were 34s, perhaps the best all-around tank of the war, well armored. Mobile, easy to produce, easy to repair. Soviet factories were churning them out by the thousands. Britain produced 8,600 tanks. Even Canada, which most Germans barely considered a military power, was producing tanks. Total Allied tank production in 1942, 57,300. Total German production, 6,200. Ratio, 9.2 to 1. These numbers appeared in Wagenführer's report with clinical precision, no editorial comment. Just the figures, arranged in tables, with totals at the bottom. But the meaning was inescapable. Germany was being outproduced by nearly 10 to 1 in tanks, 6 to 1 in aircraft. The numbers for artillery pieces, trucks, and other equipment showed similar disparities. In merchant shipping, critical for supplying armies across oceans, the gap was even wider. American shipyards alone were launching more tonnage per month than Germany had ever built in peacetime, and these were the numbers for 1942. The projections for 1943 were worse. Allied production was increasing, American factories were hitting their stride. Soviet industry, reorganized beyond the Urals, was expanding production month by month. By the end of 1943, Wagenführer estimated, Allied tank production would exceed 60,000 vehicles. German production might reach 10,000 if everything went perfectly. Germany was not losing the production war by a little. Germany was being buried. Wagenführer's report landed on desks throughout the upper levels of the Speer Ministry in mid-March of 1943. The initial responses were muted. Some officials thanked him for the thorough analysis. Others questioned his methodology. Were his estimates of Allied production reliable? How could he be certain the numbers were accurate? These were fair questions, and Wagenführer addressed them in follow-up memos. He explained his sources, described his cross-checking procedures, showed how his estimates aligned with physical evidence from the battlefield. When American troops landed in North Africa in November of 1942, they had brought with them enormous quantities of equipment, thousands of vehicles, mountains of supplies, and infrastructure built seemingly overnight. This was consistent with Wagenführer's production estimates. If America could produce 24,000 tanks in a year, then deploying several hundred to North Africa was trivial. But some officials remained skeptical, not because they doubted Wagenführer's competence, but because accepting his conclusions required accepting that Germany was going to lose the war. The numbers, if accurate, meant that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged war against the combined Allied powers. Every month that passed, the disparity would grow. Eventually, perhaps in 1944, perhaps in 1945, Germany would simply run out of everything: fuel, ammunition, vehicles, replacement weapons. The Wehrmacht would be left with veteran soldiers and no equipment. This was politically impossible to say out loud. Germany in early 1943 still controlled most of Europe. German armies, though stretched thin, still held vast territories from the Atlantic to deep inside the Soviet Union. The war was not yet obviously lost. Defeats like Stalingrad could be explained as temporary setbacks, mistakes that would be corrected. To say that Germany was doomed because of production statistics seemed defeatist, perhaps even treasonous. So Wagenführer's report was filed. Noted, discussed in quiet rooms by men who understood what the numbers meant, but had no power to change them. And the war continued. The production statistics told one story, the battlefield told another, and by the spring of 1943, those two stories were beginning to converge in ways that made Wagenführer's numbers impossible to ignore. In the East, the Wehrmacht was learning what Materialschlacht meant in practice. After the disaster at Stalingrad in February, where an entire German army had been encircled and destroyed, Soviet forces launched a series of offensives that pushed German lines back hundreds of kilometers. The Red Army was not just larger than before, it was better equipped. 34 tanks appeared in ever greater numbers. Soviet artillery barrages delivered tonnages that matched or exceeded German fire. Entire Soviet armies seemed to materialize with full equipment, attack, and when they were beaten back, new armies would appear a few weeks later, equally well supplied. This was exactly what Wagenführer's statistics predicted. The Soviet Union was producing tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. Soviet industry had absorbed catastrophic losses in 1941, losing territory that contained 63% of pre-war coal production, 68% of pig iron production, 58% of steel production. Yet, by mid-1943, Soviet military production exceeded 1940 levels. The evacuated factories were working. The industrial base beyond the Urals was functioning, and every month, more Soviet tanks and aircraft and artillery pieces rolled off assembly lines and moved west toward the front. German commanders on the Eastern Front sent increasingly desperate requests for equipment. Panzer divisions that were supposed to have 200 tanks were operating with 70 or 80. Infantry divisions lacked trucks, forcing them to rely on horse-drawn transport, an absurdity in mechanized warfare. But there were not enough vehicles. Artillery units rationed shells. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now faced Soviet air forces that could replace losses faster than German fighters could inflict them. The problem was not German soldiers. Wehrmacht troops remained, by most accounts, the most tactically proficient army in the world. German officers understood combined arms warfare, practiced sophisticated defensive tactics, and could mount effective counterattacks with minimal resources. But tactical excellence only delayed the inevitable when the enemy could replace every loss, and Germany could not. Wagenführer tracked these patterns in his monthly reports. German panzer losses on the Eastern Front averaged approximately 500 vehicles per month in the first half of 1943. German production of tanks and assault guns was running at about 750 vehicles per month. This should have allowed the Wehrmacht to replace losses and slowly build up strength, but it did not, because many of the newly produced vehicles never reached the front. Transportation networks were breaking down. Allied bombing was beginning to disrupt rail lines. Fuel shortages meant tanks sat immobile, waiting for gasoline that did not arrive. And increasingly, Germany was having to divert production to other theatres, North Africa, Italy, the Atlantic Wall defences. The mathematics were straightforward. If you lose 500 tanks per month and produce 750, you should gain 250 tanks per month. But if 200 of those new tanks never reach the front due to transportation and supply problems, you are effectively losing 50 tanks per month. Meanwhile, the Soviets were producing 2,000 tanks per month. They could afford losses. Germany could not. In May of 1943, Wagenführer's section produced a supplemental report focusing specifically on armoured vehicle production. The title was bureaucratic, Analysis of Comparative Armoured Fighting Vehicle Production Capacity, 1942 through 1943, with projections for 1944. The content was devastating. The report noted that German tank production in 1943 was projected to reach approximately 10,000 vehicles, a substantial increase over 1942, reflecting Speer's rationalization efforts. But Allied tank production for 1943 was estimated at 68,000 vehicles. The ratio was worse than 6-1, and the projection for 1944 showed the gap widening further. Even if Germany achieved optimistic production targets, even if Speer's planned expansion of tank production succeeded completely, German output in 1944 would be approximately 20,000 tanks. Allied production was projected at over 80,000. The report concluded with a sentence that was as close as a German bureaucrat in 1943 could come to stating the obvious. Replacement of combat losses at current attrition rates will remain problematic across all theatres, absent unforeseen degradation of enemy production capacity. Translation: we cannot win a war of attrition, not against these production numbers. Unless something dramatic happens, unless Allied factories are destroyed, or the Allied coalition falls apart, or some wonder weapon changes the fundamental nature of warfare, Germany will be ground down by sheer weight of material. The report was distributed to relevant offices within the Speer ministry and to certain Wehrmacht commands. It was read, it was discussed, and nothing changed, because nothing could change. Germany did not have the industrial capacity to match Allied production. This was not a matter of willpower or efficiency or clever strategy. It was basic arithmetic. You cannot produce what you do not have the resources to produce. The resources question was, in many ways, more fundamental than the production question. Germany had factories. It had skilled workers, though many were now in uniform, replaced by forced labourers whose productivity was lower. It had engineers capable of designing excellent weapons. What Germany increasingly lacked were the raw materials those factories needed. Steel production depended on iron ore. Germany's domestic iron ore was low grade, requiring more processing to produce usable steel. High-grade ore came primarily from Sweden, shipped across the Baltic Sea or through Norwegian ports. This made German steel production vulnerable to naval interdiction. If Allied forces could disrupt Swedish ore shipments, German steel production would collapse. Oil was an even more critical constraint. Germany had virtually no domestic oil production. Before the war, it had imported oil from the Soviet Union, Romania, and other sources. When war came, those imports became precarious. Romanian oil fields continued producing roughly 5 million tons per year, but this was barely enough to sustain current operations. Germany's synthetic fuel program, based on coal-to-liquids conversion, produced additional fuel, but the synthetic plants were enormous, expensive, and increasingly targeted by Allied bombers. By 1943, fuel shortages were affecting every aspect of German military operations. Luftwaffe training was cut back, leaving new pilots with fewer flying hours before being sent to combat units. Panzer divisions sat idle, unable to conduct large-scale maneuvers because there was not enough fuel. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet remained in port much of the time, conserving fuel for critical operations. Wagenführer's section tracked fuel consumption and production with the same meticulousness they applied to everything else. The numbers showed a declining margin. Germany in 1943 was consuming fuel slightly faster than it was producing and importing it. Reserves were being drawn down. Unless production increased or consumption decreased, Germany would face a genuine fuel crisis by late 1944. Meanwhile, the Allies had fuel in abundance. The United States alone produced roughly 200 million tons of oil per year, more than 40 times Romanian production. American forces never worried about fuel shortages. They could operate tanks and aircraft and ships at full capacity without rationing. British forces, despite being entirely dependent on imported oil, received enough American shipments to operate normally. One comparison stood out in Wagenführer's reports. In 1942, Britain imported 5 times as much oil from the United States as Germany imported from Romania. Britain, an island nation being hunted by U-boats, received vastly more fuel than Germany obtained from its primary source. This was despite German submarines sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships. American production simply overwhelmed German interdiction efforts. The same pattern appeared across virtually every raw material category. Copper, aluminum, rubber, rare metals, chemicals. The Allies had access to global supply networks while Germany depended on a limited number of sources within occupied Europe. When those sources were threatened, German production suffered. Aluminum production illustrated the problem clearly. Aluminum was critical for aircraft production. Germany's aluminum came primarily from bauxite mined in southern France and the Balkans, processed in plants powered by hydroelectric stations. Allied bombing of these processing plants or interdiction of bauxite shipments could cripple German aircraft production, and there were no alternative sources. Germany could not simply buy aluminum from neutral countries. Global aluminum production was controlled by the Allies. This created a fundamental asymmetry. Allied planners could calculate how much production capacity to build, knowing that raw materials would be available. German planners had to constantly balance production targets against resource constraints, knowing that building more factories meant nothing if those factories lacked raw materials to process. Wagenführer's reports documented this asymmetry exhaustively. He showed that even if Germany achieved perfect efficiency, Even if every factory operated at maximum capacity, every worker performed optimally, every resource was allocated with perfect rationality, German production would still fall short of Allied levels because Germany simply did not control enough raw materials. This was the deepest level of the problem. It was not merely that Germany was being outproduced. It was that Germany could never produce enough because it lacked the physical resources that industrial production required. The war had become a test of industrial capacity, and Germany had entered that test already disadvantaged. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the summer of 1943, the picture Wagenführer's reports painted was increasingly difficult to dismiss. German intelligence agencies, the Abwehr, the Sicherheitsdienst, and the military's own intelligence branches were reaching similar conclusions from different angles. Fremde Heer Ost, the Foreign Army's East Intelligence Section responsible for analyzing the Soviet military, was led by General Major Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen was a professional intelligence officer, methodical and apolitical in the manner of staff officers who valued accuracy over ideology. His section tracked Soviet order of battle, which divisions existed, where they were located, what equipment they possessed. This was difficult work. The Red Army was secretive, constantly reorganizing, operating across vast territories. But by mid-1943, Fremde Heer Ost had developed reasonable estimates of Soviet strength. Those estimates were alarming. Despite catastrophic losses in 1941 and 42 casualties in the millions, thousands of tanks destroyed, tens of thousands of artillery pieces lost, the Red Army in mid-1943 was stronger than it had been at the start of the war. Soviet divisions that had been destroyed were being reformed. Tank armies that had ceased to exist were being reconstituted with new equipment. The Red Army was not just recovering from its losses. It was growing. This was consistent with Wagenführer's production statistics. If the Soviet Union was producing 2,000 tanks per month and losing perhaps 800 to 1,000 in combat, then Soviet tank forces would grow by roughly 1,000 vehicles per month. Over 6 months, that meant 6,000 additional tanks in Soviet service. The numbers aligned. Fremde Heer West, responsible for analyzing Western Allied forces, tracked a different kind of build-up. In Britain, American and British forces were accumulating men and material for an eventual invasion of France. Reconnaissance flights and intelligence reports documented vast supply depots, airfields filled with bombers and fighters, ports crowded with ships. The scale of the build-up suggested an invasion force of unprecedented size. Allied deception operations made it difficult to know exactly where or when the invasion would come, but the general preparation was obvious, and the quantity of material being assembled was staggering. Wagenführer's section received reports from Fremde Heer West and incorporated them into broader production estimates. If the Allies were stockpiling this much equipment in Britain, how much were they producing total? How much was going to the Mediterranean theatre, to the Pacific, to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease? The calculations pointed to production levels even higher than Wagenführer's earlier estimates. American industry was not just outproducing Germany. It was outproducing Germany while simultaneously supplying Britain, supplying the Soviet Union, and equipping American forces across multiple theatres. The abundance seemed almost impossible, yet the physical evidence was undeniable. German commanders who encountered Allied forces experienced this abundance firsthand. When American troops landed in North Africa in November of 1942, they brought with them not just weapons, but entire infrastructure systems, mobile workshops, field hospitals, communications, equipment, enough spare parts to keep equipment running indefinitely. German officers, accustomed to operating with minimal logistics, were stunned by American supply practices. Americans seemed to have unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited everything. One often repeated story, possibly apocryphal, but consistent with documented German reactions, involved a captured German officer being marched past American supply dumps near the front lines. He reportedly said something to the effect of, "Now, I understand how you will beat us. You pile up supplies until the weight of them crushes us. This was not sophisticated military analysis, but it captured an important truth. The war in Europe had become Materialschlacht, and the side with more material would win. German tactical excellence, superior tank designs, better trained soldiers, these advantages mattered less and less as the material disparity widened. In Berlin, in his underground office, Wagenfeuer continued producing his monthly reports. The format remained consistent: tables of production figures, comparative analysis, projections based on current trends. The conclusions became more emphatic as the data accumulated. By late 1943, he was no longer hedging his estimates with caveats about uncertainty. The numbers were solid. Multiple sources confirmed them. Physical evidence from the battlefield validated them. Germany was being outproduced by ratios that made strategic victory impossible absent catastrophic disruption of Allied production. The reports circulated within the Speer Ministry and to selected Wehrmacht commands. They were read by men who understood production factory managers, logistics officers, economic planners. Almost universally, these men accepted Wagenfeuer's analysis. The numbers were too clear to dispute. But the reports did not circulate to the highest levels of German leadership. Hitler did not read them. Neither did most of his inner circle. This was partly because the reports were technical documents filled with statistics and jargon, not the kind of material that reached Führer's desk. But it was also because the conclusions were politically unacceptable. German propaganda in 1943 emphasized resilience, determination, and the inevitability of final victory. Goebbels's Ministry of Propaganda produced films showing German factories producing tanks, German workers laboring for victory, German scientists developing wonder weapons. The narrative was one of strength and progress. Wagenfeuer's statistics told a different story. They said that Germany was weak, that the enemy was vastly stronger, that current trends inevitably led to defeat. This was not a message the Nazi leadership wanted to hear, much less disseminate. So the reports remained within technical circles read by men who could do nothing about the problems they described, except try to maximize efficiency within impossible constraints. Albert Speer himself understood the situation. As armaments minister, he received all of Wagenfeuer's reports and recognized their implications. Speer was neither stupid nor delusional. He knew Germany was losing the production war. His response was to focus on what could be controlled, increasing German production through rationalization, prioritizing critical weapons systems, fighting for resources against competing bureaucracies. Under Speer's direction, German armaments production increased dramatically from 1942 through mid-1944. Aircraft production more than doubled. Tank production tripled. This was a genuine achievement, accomplished despite Allied bombing, despite resource shortages, despite the conscription of skilled workers into military service. But it was not enough. Even Germany's best production figures could not close the gap. The Allies were simply too far ahead, and their lead was growing. In late 1943, Speer's planning department produced a comprehensive report on projected production capacity for 1944. The report assumed optimistic conditions: minimal disruption from bombing, adequate raw material supplies, successful implementation of rationalization measures. Under these assumptions, Germany could produce approximately 20,000 tanks in 1944. The same report included estimates of Allied production for 1944, approximately 85,000 tanks. Even if everything went perfectly for Germany, the Allies would produce more than 4 times as many tanks. The ratios for aircraft production were similar. Germany's optimistic projection for 1944 was 40,000 aircraft. Allied production, already running at 96,000 in 1943, was projected to reach 115,000 or more. These projections were not secret defeatist propaganda. They were internal planning documents, used to allocate resources and set production priorities. But they made clear what anyone who studied the numbers could see: Germany was going to lose the war of production. The only questions were how long the process would take and how much destruction would occur before defeat became undeniable. The human dimension of these statistics was something Wagenfeuer rarely addressed in his reports. His job was to count, to analyze, to project. He dealt in aggregates, in averages, in trends. But behind every number was a person or a weapon or a factory, and the implications of the numbers were ultimately about human consequences. 6-to-1 ratios in tank production meant that for every German panzer destroyed, the Allies could field 6 replacements. From a tactical perspective, this meant German armoured forces had to achieve kill ratios of better than 6-to-1 just to break even, and they had to do this consistently, across every engagement, for years. This was impossible. No army could sustain those performance requirements. From the perspective of a German tanker, it meant something simpler and more terrible. You were going to die. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but eventually. The odds were too steep. The enemy had too many tanks. Sooner or later, a Sherman or a 34 would put a shell through your armour, and that would be the end. Similar calculations applied to pilots, to infantrymen, to everyone in the Wehrmacht. The enemy could replace losses. Germany could not. Over time, attrition would grind down German strength while Allied strength grew. The psychological impact of this reality was profound. German soldiers and officers understood, at some level, that they were in a losing fight. Official propaganda insisted otherwise, but propaganda could not change what soldiers saw with their own eyes. Enemy forces that kept coming, enemy equipment that kept arriving, enemy air forces that filled the skies while the Luftwaffe grew weaker. This knowledge did not cause immediate collapse. The Wehrmacht continued fighting with skill and determination through 1944 and into 1945. Discipline held. Unit cohesion remained strong. German forces mounted effective defences and occasionally successful counterattacks. But the underlying trend was unmistakable. Germany was losing, and everyone who paid attention knew it. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, provided the most dramatic validation of Wagenfeuer's statistics that even skeptics could not ignore. The invasion force was enormous. Over 150,000 troops landed on the first day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. But more impressive than the initial assault was the logistics. Within weeks, Allied forces had established complete supply infrastructure on the French coast. They built artificial harbours, massive prefabricated structures, towed across the English Channel, and assembled on the beaches. They laid fuel pipelines. They established repair depots, ammunition dumps, and supply distribution networks. The scale was industrial, methodical, and overwhelming. German commanders defending Normandy found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to have infinite resources. Allied artillery barrages used ammunition at rates German forces could not match. Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties per day, while the Luftwaffe could barely maintain a presence over the battlefield. Allied tanks, when destroyed, were replaced within days. German panzers, when lost, might take weeks to replace if they were replaced at all. One incident captured the disparity vividly. During the Allied advance toward the Rhine in early 1945, American supply operations became so overwhelmed by their own logistics that at one crossing point, more than 12,000 railway cars loaded with supplies backed up, waiting to be unloaded. The Americans had so much material they temporarily ran out of places to put it. They formed improvised storage dumps, some covering dozens of acres, filled with captured German equipment because there was no room for American supplies. This was what Materialschlacht looked like in practice. The Allies did not win through superior tactics or better soldiers. They won through logistics. They produced more, transported more, supplied their forces with everything needed to sustain offensive operations, while German forces struggled with shortages of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and basic supplies. Wagenfeuer's reports through 1944 documented the widening gap. German production, despite Allied bombing and resource shortages, held relatively steady through the first half of the year. Then, in the second half of 1944, it began to collapse. Allied strategic bombing, which had been escalating since 1943, reached devastating intensity in 1944. American heavy bombers struck by day, British bombers struck at night. Targets were systematic: fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, transportation networks, aircraft production facilities. German industry tried to adapt, dispersing production, moving factories underground, implementing repair procedures, but the bombing was relentless. Synthetic fuel production provided the clearest example of bombing's impact. In May of 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced around 92,000 tons of aviation fuel. Then the Americans launched Operation Point Blank, a concentrated campaign against fuel production. By September, synthetic fuel output had dropped to 5,000 tons, a decline of over 90%. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe could not fly. Without flying, pilots could not train. Without training, new pilots died quickly in combat. This created a death spiral. Fuel shortages grounded the Luftwaffe, which allowed Allied bombers to operate more freely, which destroyed more fuel plants, which created worse fuel shortages. German tank production followed a similar pattern. In July of 1944, Germany produced over 1,700 tanks and assault guns, the highest monthly output of the entire war. Then, Allied bombing of component manufacturers and transportation networks began taking effect. By January of 1945, production had dropped below 700 vehicles. By March, it was under 300. The statistics in Wagenführer's final reports showed curves declining towards zero. Germany was not just losing the production war anymore. German industry was being systematically destroyed. The war economy that had sustained the Wehrmacht for 5 years was collapsing. In January of 1945, as Soviet forces prepared to launch their final offensive toward Berlin, Reinhard Gehlen of Fremde Heere Ost prepared an intelligence assessment showing massive Soviet force concentrations on the Vistula front. The assessment concluded that the Soviets were about to attack with overwhelming strength, hundreds of divisions, thousands of tanks, an unstoppable wave that would crush German defences and drive them to Berlin. Gehlen presented this assessment to General Guderian, who brought it to Hitler. The Führer's response, according to Guderian's post-war account, was to call Gehlen insane and demand that he be committed to an asylum. The numbers were impossible, Hitler insisted. The Soviets could not possibly have that many forces. German intelligence was exaggerating, or deceived by Soviet deception, or defeatism. 2 weeks later, the Soviet offensive began exactly as Gehlen had predicted. Over 2 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, smashed through German lines and advanced rapidly westward. German forces, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate skill but could not stop the onslaught. The tide of Soviet tanks Gehlen had predicted and which Hitler had dismissed as fantasy was real. The numbers were accurate. This episode illustrated the fundamental problem with Germany's relationship to intelligence in the final years of the war. Accurate information was available. Analysts like Gehlen and Wagenführer produced careful, well-sourced reports. But when that information contradicted Nazi ideology or Hitler's intuitions, it was rejected. It was not enough to be right. Being right required power to act on that knowledge, and in Nazi Germany, power was concentrated in the hands of men who refused to accept uncomfortable truths. Wagenführer's final significant report was prepared in early 1945, as Allied forces closed on Germany from both east and west. He titled it Rechenschaftsbericht 1944 Accountability Report 1944. It was a comprehensive summary of the German war economy's final full year of operation, compiled with the understanding that the war was nearly over and he was creating a historical record. The report was meticulous. Production figures by month and category, resource allocation, labour distribution, transportation capacity, the impact of bombing, the breakdown of supply networks, Everything was documented with the same care Wagenfeuer had brought to his work throughout the war. The final section contained analysis that was, for a German bureaucrat in early 1945, remarkably frank. German industry had achieved impressive feats of improvisation and adaptation. Production had held up longer than seemed possible given the strategic situation. Workers and engineers had performed near miracles of efficiency, but none of it had been enough. Allied production had simply been too great. The material disparity had been so vast that German efforts to close the gap were meaningless. The war had been lost not through military incompetence or moral failure, but through basic arithmetic. Germany lacked the resources to fight a prolonged industrial war against enemies who possessed superior industrial capacity. This analysis was not defeatist in the sense of giving up, it was simply descriptive. The numbers said what they said. Production statistics were facts, not opinions. And those facts had pointed to German defeat since at least 1943. Wagenfeuer did not submit this report through official channels. There was no point. The administrative apparatus was collapsing. Berlin was under bombardment. Soviet forces were approaching. Instead, he stored the report with other documentation, hoping it might survive for historical purposes. It did survive. American forces captured Wagenfeuer's offices in April of 1945. His reports, along with vast quantities of other German economic documentation, were seized and eventually analyzed by Allied intelligence. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, charged with assessing the impact of Allied bombing on Germany, relied heavily on German production records that Wagenfeuer and his colleagues had compiled. Those records confirmed what Wagenfeuer had calculated during the war. Germany had been comprehensively outproduced. Allied industrial superiority had been so great that German defeat was virtually certain once the war became a contest of material production. After the war, Wagenfeuer was detained by American forces, but not as a war criminal. The Americans wanted his expertise. They were trying to understand how the German war economy had functioned, where its weaknesses had been, how it had sustained Wehrmacht operations for so long, despite overwhelming Allied advantages. Wagenfeuer cooperated fully. He had no reason to lie or dissemble. His work had been statistical analysis, not ideology or atrocity. He answered questions, explained methodologies, and helped American analysts understand German economic data. His knowledge was valuable. The Americans were already thinking about the next potential conflict against the Soviet Union and understanding how industrial capacity translated into military power was relevant to that future contest. He was released after several months of interrogation. Post-war Germany was chaotic, divided among occupation zones, struggling with basic survival. Wagenfeuer found work at economic research institutes in what would become West Germany, first in temporary positions, eventually in more stable academic roles. He published papers on reconstruction, economics, and industrial development. He avoided writing about the war. His wartime reports remained classified in American archives. He lived quietly through the economic miracle years, watching West Germany rebuild with American aid and develop into an industrial power once again, though this time within the framework of Western alliance rather than conquest. He retired in the 1960s, continued occasional consulting work, and died in 1976 at age 75. His obituaries mentioned his post-war academic work. They did not mention his wartime role as the man who calculated German defeat with statistical precision. The deeper significance of Wagenfeuer's story extends beyond one man's career. It illuminates something fundamental about how Nazi Germany functioned and why it failed. Nazi ideology emphasized willpower, racial superiority, the triumph of spirit over material constraints. These were not just propaganda slogans. They represented genuine beliefs among the Nazi leadership. Hitler and his inner circle believed that determination could overcome industrial disadvantages, that superior German soldiers could defeat numerically superior enemies, that wonder weapons and miraculous breakthroughs would change the war's trajectory. Against this ideological certainty stood the quiet authority of numbers. Statistics said that willpower did not manufacture tanks. Racial theories did not produce synthetic fuel. Determination did not overcome the reality that Germany controlled insufficient resources to fight prolonged industrial warfare against enemies who possessed those resources in abundance. The tragedy, one of many tragedies in this story, was that accurate information existed within the German system. Men like Wagenführer produced careful analyses. Intelligence officers like Gehlen assessed enemy capabilities realistically. These reports documented German weaknesses and Allied strengths with precision. But accurate information without the power to act on it is useless. The men who had power, Hitler above all, refused to accept information that contradicted their worldview. When Gehlen showed that Soviet forces were massing for attack, Hitler called him insane. When production reports showed insurmountable Allied advantages, those reports were filed away and ignored. This was not stupidity. It was something more dangerous, the subordination of reality to ideology. Nazi Germany could not adapt to material realities because Nazi ideology claimed that material realities were subordinate to will and racial quality. To admit that production statistics mattered more than determination would have meant admitting that the entire Nazi worldview was wrong. So the war continued even after the outcome was mathematically certain. Cities were bombed into ruins. Millions more died. The Reich collapsed not because Germans lost heart, but because Germany ran out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, industrial capacity, men. In the end, the economists were right. The war had been decided by factories and supply chains and raw material production. Tactics mattered, training mattered, but they mattered less than tonnage of steel and gallons of fuel and units produced per month. World War II in Europe was won by industrial capacity, and the side with greater capacity was always going to win. There is a final irony worth noting. After the war, when the United States began preparing for potential conflict with the Soviet Union, American planners applied the lessons they had learned from defeating Germany. They understood that industrial capacity was decisive. They built enormous military-industrial infrastructure. They maintained technological advantages. They prepared to fight the same kind of war they had fought against Germany, a war of material production, and they recruited German experts to help them. Reinhard Gehlen, whose intelligence assessments Hitler had dismissed as insanity, was brought into American service. His Fremde Heerost staff, which had analyzed Soviet capabilities during the war, became the nucleus of a new Western intelligence organization focused on the Soviet Union. Gehlen's knowledge, developed by calculating Soviet production capacity for the Wehrmacht, now served American interests in the Cold War. German scientists and engineers who had developed weapons systems for the Third Reich were recruited through Operation Paperclip to work on American military projects. Their expertise in rocketry, jet propulsion, and advanced weapons development transferred directly to American programs. The knowledge that had failed to save Nazi Germany because that knowledge was rejected by leaders who preferred ideology to facts became valuable to America precisely because American leaders understood what Nazi leaders had not: that industrial war was decided by production capacity, and that accurate information about enemy capabilities was essential for planning. The men who had calculated German defeat helped America prepare for the next potential conflict, carrying forward the lesson that numbers matter, that production capacity determines outcomes, that modern warfare is as much about factories as battlefields. Looking back from 8 decades later, what does this story tell us about World War II that conventional military histories miss? It tells us that the outcome was visible in spreadsheets long before it was visible in battle. Economic analysts could see the future written in production statistics. They calculated defeat with precision and watched it unfold exactly as the mathematics predicted. It tells us that intelligence and information are worthless without leadership willing to act on them. Germany had capable analysts who understood Allied advantages. Those analysts produced accurate reports, but accurate reports filed away and ignored accomplish nothing. Most fundamentally, it tells us that industrialized warfare between modern nations is decided by industrial capacity. Courage, skill, tactics, and technology all matter. but they matter less than the ability to produce war material in sufficient quantities to sustain military operations. Germany had excellent soldiers and innovative weapons. What it lacked was enough of everything, and in total war, enough is determined by what your enemies possess. The Allies, particularly the United States, understood this from the beginning. Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft was not an optimistic exaggeration. It was the opening move in an industrial mobilization designed to bury the Axis powers under weight of material. By 1944, America was producing not 50,000 but nearly 100,000 aircraft per year, along with proportional increases in every other category of military equipment. That production decided the war. Not the heroics at D-Day, though those were real. Not the sacrifice of Soviet soldiers, though that sacrifice was immense. Not the strategic bombing campaign, though it contributed. The war was decided by the fact that Allied factories could produce more than German factories. Allied supply chains could deliver more than German supply chains. Allied economies could sustain greater military expenditure than the German economy. And some Germans knew this. They calculated it. They documented it. They tried to communicate it to leaders who would not listen. This is perhaps the deepest lesson. Truth is not enough. Information is not enough. Being right is not enough. Power matters. Institutions matter. The relationship between knowledge and decision-making matters. And when leaders reject accurate information because it contradicts ideology, catastrophe follows not immediately, but inevitably, as surely as mathematical proofs unfold. The numbers never lied. They pointed toward German defeat from early 1943 onward. Everything after that was just the slow process of arithmetic asserting itself in the physical world, cities destroyed, armies shattered, millions dead, a regime collapsed, all of it predictable, all of it calculated in advance by men sitting in underground offices, counting tanks and aircraft and tons of steel, watching the numbers tell a story their leaders refused to hear. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.